The autumn wind swept through the grand courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Queen Camilla walked briskly toward the main entrance. Her personal secretary hurried behind her, clutching a folder of documents that would change everything. The morning had started like any other, but by noon it would become one of the most controversial days in recent royal history. Princess Charlotte had been preparing for her first major public appearance as a young royal. At just 9 years old, she was scheduled to accompany her grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth's portrait unveiling ceremony. The event was meant to showcase the next generation of royals, with Charlotte representing the future of the monarchy. Her parents, Prince William and Princess Catherine, had spent weeks preparing her for this moment. However, Camilla had different plans. Unknown to the rest of the royal family, she had been quietly arranging for her own granddaughter, Eliza Lopes, to take Charlotte's place at the ceremony. Eliza was the daughter of Camilla's daughter Laura, and though she held no official royal title, Camilla believed it was time to elevate her family's position within the monarchy. The queen consort had convinced herself that this substitution would go unnoticed. After all, both girls were young, blonde, and could easily be mistaken for each other from a distance. She had even arranged for Eliza to wear a dress similar to the one Charlotte had planned to wear. The photographers would get their pictures, the public would see a young royal, and nobody would be the wiser. Captain James Morrison had been serving as a royal guard for over 15 years. His dedication to protecting the royal family was unwavering, and he knew every protocol by heart. That morning, he had been briefed about Princess Charlotte's arrival and the security measures that needed to be in place. He had memorized her route, her scheduled arrival time, and the people who would be accompanying her. When Camilla approached the entrance with a young girl who was clearly not Princess Charlotte, Morrison's trained eye immediately spotted the deception. The girl's posture was different, her mannerisms unfamiliar, and most importantly, she lacked the distinctive features that made Charlotte recognizable to those who worked closely with the royal family. Morrison stepped forward, his hand raised in a respectful but firm gesture. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice steady and professional. "I'm afraid I cannot allow this young lady to proceed to the ceremony venue." Camilla stopped abruptly, her face flushing with a mixture of surprise and indignation. "Excuse me, Captain? This is Princess Charlotte, and she has every right to attend this ceremony." The guard remained unmoved. His years of training had taught him to trust his instincts, and every fiber of his being told him that something was wrong. "With all due respect, Your Majesty, I am quite familiar with Princess Charlotte's appearance, and this is not her." The tension in the air became palpable. Camilla's secretary shifted nervously, clutching the folder tighter. Other staff members who had been bustling about their duties began to slow their pace, sensing that something unusual was happening. Eliza, who had been excited about the special day her grandmother had promised her, began to look confused and frightened. She tugged at Camilla's sleeve, whispering something that only made the queen consort more agitated. "Captain Morrison," Camilla said, her voice rising slightly, "I am ordering you to step aside. This child needs to get to the ceremony, and your interference is completely inappropriate." But Morrison had sworn an oath to protect the royal family and uphold the integrity of the monarchy. He had seen too much in his years of service to be intimidated, even by the queen consort herself. "I cannot comply with that order, Your Majesty. If this were indeed Princess Charlotte, I would gladly escort her to the ceremony myself. However, I have a duty to ensure that only authorized individuals participate in official royal events." The standoff continued for several minutes, with neither side willing to back down. Camilla's face grew redder with each passing moment, while Morrison remained as still as a statue, his resolve unshaken. Word of the confrontation began to spread through the palace corridors. Staff members whispered among themselves, and soon news of the incident reached the private offices of Prince William and Princess Catherine. The Prince and Princess of Wales were initially confused by the reports, as they had been under the impression that Charlotte was safely at home with her tutors. When William realized what was happening, his anger was swift and decisive. He immediately contacted the head of palace security and demanded that the situation be resolved immediately. Princess Catherine, meanwhile, rushed to ensure that Charlotte was indeed safe and accounted for. The ceremony venue, which had been buzzing with anticipation, gradually fell into an uncomfortable silence as guests began to notice that the expected young royal had not arrived. Photographers adjusted their equipment, and event coordinators checked their schedules, unsure of what was causing the delay. Back at the entrance, Morrison continued to stand his ground. His colleagues had arrived to support him, and it became clear that this was not simply a case of mistaken identity. The head of security arrived shortly after, and after a brief conversation with Morrison, approached Camilla with a grave expression. "Your Majesty," the security chief said carefully, "I'm afraid we'll need to have a conversation about this matter in private." Camilla knew that her plan had failed spectacularly. The carefully orchestrated substitution had crumbled under the watchful eye of a dedicated guard who refused to compromise his principles. As she was led away for questioning, Eliza was gently escorted to a private room where she could be cared for until her parents arrived. The palace, which had been preparing for a celebration of royal tradition, was now dealing with its biggest internal crisis in years. The question on everyone's mind was simple. How had the queen consort thought she could get away with such a brazen attempt at deception? Morrison returned to his post. His duty fulfilled, but his mind troubled by the implications of what had just transpired. He had prevented a potential scandal, but he knew that the repercussions of this incident would echo through the halls of the palace for months to come. The ceremony was quietly postponed, and official statements were hastily prepared to explain the delay to the waiting media and guests. But behind the scenes, a much larger conversation was about to begin about trust, authority, and the very foundations of the modern monarchy. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds, it became clear that this was not just a simple case of mistaken identity or poor judgment. It was the beginning of a crisis that would test the very fabric of the royal family and force them to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the lengths some would go to secure their family's position in the line of succession. The royal guard had done more than just stop a suspicious person at the door. He had potentially prevented a constitutional crisis and protected the integrity of an institution that millions of people around the world looked up to and respected. Prince William arrived at Buckingham Palace within the hour, his face a mask of controlled fury. The drive from Kensington Palace had given him time to process the magnitude of what had happened, and with each passing minute, his disbelief had transformed into something much deeper and more dangerous. This was not just about a canceled ceremony or a case of poor judgment. This was about trust, family, and the very principles upon which the monarchy stood. Princess Catherine followed shortly after. Having ensured that Charlotte was safe and completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded in her name. The young princess had been at her tutoring session, working on her French pronunciation, blissfully ignorant that someone had tried to use her identity for their own purposes. The emergency meeting was called in the Oak Room, one of the palace's most private spaces. Present were King Charles III, Prince William, Princess Catherine, and several senior advisors. Notably absent was Queen Camilla, who had been asked to wait in her private apartments while the family decided how to handle the situation. King Charles looked older than his years as he sat at the head of the polished oak table. The weight of the crown had always been heavy, but family betrayals cut deeper than any political crisis or media scandal. His wife, the woman he had fought so hard to marry and see accepted by the public, had potentially damaged everything they had worked to build. "I need to understand exactly what happened," the king said, his voice quiet but carrying the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime in preparation for moments like this. Leave nothing out. The head of palace security provided a detailed account of the morning's events. He described Captain Morrison's quick thinking, Camilla's increasingly desperate attempts to push through with her plan, and the confusion that had spread throughout the palace staff when the deception became apparent. Prince William listened in stony silence until the security chief finished his report. When he finally spoke, his words were measured but filled with barely contained anger. She tried to replace my daughter with her granddaughter at an official royal event. She endangered Charlotte's reputation, confused a young child who had no idea what was happening, and made a mockery of everything we stand for. Princess Catherine placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm, but her own expression showed that she was equally disturbed by what had transpired. "What I don't understand," she said, "is how Camilla thought this could possibly work. Surely she must have known that people would notice." The king's private secretary, who had been reviewing the events of the past several weeks, cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty, if I may, there have been some concerning patterns in the Queen Consort's behavior recently. She has been making requests for her family members to attend various royal functions, and there have been several instances where she has attempted to elevate their status without proper consultation." This revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. What had initially appeared to be an isolated incident of poor judgment was beginning to look like part of a larger pattern of behavior that threatened the very structure of the monarchy. Meanwhile, in her private apartments, Camilla paced back and forth across the Persian carpet that had been a wedding gift from the people of Scotland. Her mind raced as she tried to formulate an explanation that would minimize the damage to her reputation and her marriage. She had convinced herself that what she had done was not fundamentally wrong, just poorly executed. Her daughter Laura had arrived at the palace to collect Eliza, and the conversation between mother and daughter had been tense. Laura had been unaware of the full scope of her mother's plan and was horrified to learn that her daughter had been used as a pawn in what was essentially an attempt to deceive the royal family and the public. "Mother, how could you put Eliza in this position?" Laura had demanded. "She's just a child. She doesn't understand the complexities of royal protocol or the potential consequences of what you asked her to do." Camilla had tried to explain that she simply wanted her granddaughter to have opportunities that she herself had been denied, but the explanation fell flat even to her own ears. The truth was more complex and more troubling than she was willing to admit, even to herself. Back in the Oak Room, the conversation had turned to the potential consequences of the incident. The ceremony had been postponed, but rumors were already beginning to circulate among the guests and media representatives who had been present. Controlling the narrative would be crucial to preventing a full-blown scandal. "We need to consider the possibility that this information will become public," the king's press secretary warned. "If it does, we need to be prepared with a response that protects the institution while acknowledging what happened." Prince William stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I don't care about protecting her reputation anymore," he said, his voice rising. "She put my daughter at risk, and she violated every principle of trust that holds this family together. If the story becomes public, then perhaps it should. People deserve to know what kind of person they are expected to respect and honor." The king raised his hand, gesturing for calm. "William, I understand your anger, and I share it, but we must think carefully about how we proceed. The monarchy is bigger than any one person, including Camilla. Our response must be measured and focused on protecting the institution." Princess Catherine spoke up, her voice steady but firm. "With all due respect, Your Majesty, the institution is only as strong as the people who represent it. If we allow this behavior to go unpunished, what message does that send? What happens the next time someone decides that the rules don't apply to them?" The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. The Princess of Wales had articulated what many in the room were thinking, but had been hesitant to say aloud. The monarchy's strength came from its adherence to tradition, protocol, and above all, trust. When that trust was broken, especially from within, the damage could be irreparable. Captain Morrison, who had been asked to provide a statement about the incident, was brought into the room. His testimony was clear, factual, and devastating. He described Camilla's attempts to convince him to look the other way, her growing agitation when he refused to comply, and her ultimate admission that the child was not Princess Charlotte. "I've served this family for 15 years, Morrison said, his voice steady and professional. "I've never seen anything like this. The Queen Consort knew exactly what she was doing, and she continued to push forward even when it became clear that her plan had been discovered." The king thanked Morrison for his service and his integrity, but the guard's testimony had made it clear that this was not a case of miscommunication or innocent mistake. This had been a deliberate attempt to deceive, and it had failed only because of the vigilance of a dedicated public servant. As the meeting continued into the evening, it became apparent that the royal family was facing its most serious internal crisis in decades. The trust that bound the family together had been broken, and the path forward was far from clear. Decisions made in the next few days would determine not just Camilla's future within the royal family, but the very nature of the monarchy itself. Outside the palace walls, life continued as normal. Tourists took pictures, guards changed shifts, and the business of government carried on. But inside those historic walls, a family was grappling with betrayal, and a nation's most important institution was being tested in ways that no constitutional scholar had ever anticipated. The second day of the crisis was ending, but the most difficult conversations were yet to come. The confrontation between King Charles and Queen Camilla took place in the privacy of their shared study, a room that had witnessed countless intimate conversations during their marriage. The morning light filtered through heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the antique furniture that had belonged to generations of monarchs. This conversation, however, would be unlike any they had shared before. Camilla entered the room with her head held high, determined to defend her actions despite the overwhelming evidence against her. She had spent the night crafting arguments that she hoped would explain her behavior and minimize the consequences. In her mind, she had simply been trying to provide opportunities for her family, something that any grandmother would want to do. "Charles," she began before he could speak, "I need you to understand that my intentions were never malicious. I simply wanted Eliza to experience what it means to be part of this family, to see the ceremonies and traditions that will shape her future." The king remained seated behind his desk, his expression unreadable. He had been awake most of the night, struggling with the reality that the woman he loved had betrayed not just his family, but everything he had sworn to protect. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with disappointment. "Camilla, you tried to replace my granddaughter at an official ceremony. You deceived palace staff, confused a young child, and put the entire institution at risk. How can you possibly justify that as wanting Eliza to experience royal life?" The Queen Consort's carefully prepared arguments began to crumble under the weight of his calm questioning. She had expected anger, shouting, perhaps even threats. Instead, she was facing something far more devastating: profound disappointment from the man whose approval she had spent years trying to earn. "I thought," she stammered, "I thought it would be a harmless substitution. They're both young girls, both part of the family in different ways. I didn't think anyone would notice. And I certainly didn't think it would cause such a tremendous fuss." King Charles stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and measured. "You didn't think anyone would notice? Camilla, Princess Charlotte is third in line to the throne. She is one of the most photographed children in the world. Did you honestly believe that experienced palace staff, trained security personnel, and members of the media wouldn't recognize the difference? The reality of her situation began to sink in as Camilla realized that her explanations were only making things worse. She had acted impulsively, driven by a desire to elevate her family's status within the royal hierarchy, but she had failed to consider the consequences of her actions. Meanwhile, Prince William was meeting with senior constitutional experts and palace advisors to discuss the unprecedented nature of the situation. Never before had a queen consort attempted to substitute one royal child for another at an official event. The legal and constitutional implications were staggering. "The issue," explained the palace's chief constitutional advisor, "is that this goes beyond a simple family disagreement. Royal ceremonies have legal significance. They establish precedent, create official records, and serve as formal documentation of the monarchy's activities. By attempting to substitute Princess Charlotte with an unrelated child, the queen consort potentially compromised the legal validity of the entire event." Princess Catherine, who had remained remarkably composed throughout the crisis, finally allowed her anger to show. "What disturbs me most," she said, "is that Camilla was willing to use a young child as a tool for her own ambitions. Eliza had no idea what was happening to her, and Charlotte could have been put in an impossible position if this deception had succeeded." The constitutional expert nodded gravely. "There's also the question of public trust. If this incident becomes known, it could seriously damage the monarchy's reputation. People expect the royal family to operate with transparency and integrity. This kind of deception undermines everything the institution stands for." Back in the king's study, the conversation between Charles and Camilla had reached a critical point. The queen consort had finally abandoned her attempts at justification and was pleading for forgiveness, but the damage had been done. "I need time to think," the king said finally. "This isn't just about forgiveness, Camilla. This is about the future of the monarchy and whether the public can trust us to act with integrity. What you did yesterday has consequences that extend far beyond our marriage." The news of the incident, despite the palace's best efforts, began to leak to the media by the third day. A junior staff member, shocked by what they had witnessed, had shared the story with a friend, who had then contacted a journalist. Within hours, the story was spreading across social media and news outlets around the world. The headlines were devastating. "Queen Camilla caught in royal deception." "Palace insider reveals shocking substitution plot." And "Royal Guard saves monarchy from constitutional crisis." The public reaction was swift and harsh, with many calling for Camilla's removal from her royal duties. Captain Morrison found himself thrust into the spotlight as the hero who had prevented a royal scandal. Interview requests poured in from news outlets around the world, but the dedicated guard declined all media appearances, stating simply that he had been doing his job and protecting the integrity of the monarchy. The palace's press office worked around the clock to manage the crisis, but the damage to Camilla's reputation was severe. Public opinion polls showed a dramatic drop in her approval ratings, with many people expressing doubt about her fitness to serve as queen consort. Princess Charlotte, still unaware of the drama that had unfolded around her, continued her normal routine of tutoring and family time. Her parents made a deliberate decision to shield her from the media coverage, but they knew that eventually she would learn about what had happened. The crisis reached its climax when King Charles made the difficult decision to temporarily suspend Camilla from all official royal duties, pending a full investigation into the incident. The announcement was made through a brief palace statement that sent shockwaves through the British establishment and royal watchers around the world. Prince William, speaking at a private family meeting, made his position clear. "Trust is the foundation of everything we do. Without it, we're just people in expensive clothes living in old buildings. Camilla broke that trust, and there have to be consequences." The investigation that followed was thorough and damaging. It revealed that this had not been an isolated incident. but part of a pattern of behavior in which Camilla had repeatedly attempted to elevate her family members' status within the royal hierarchy. She had made unauthorized promises to her relatives, arranged for them to attend exclusive events without proper approval, and had even suggested that her granddaughter might one day be given an official royal title. As autumn turned to winter, the royal family began the slow process of rebuilding trust and moving forward. Camilla remained in seclusion, her future within the monarchy uncertain. King Charles faced the most difficult decision of his reign, torn between his love for his wife and his duty to protect the institution he had sworn to serve. Captain Morrison returned to his duties, his actions having earned him the respect of his colleagues and the gratitude of the royal family. His quick thinking and unwavering dedication to protocol had prevented what could have been a constitutional crisis of unprecedented proportions. The incident served as a stark reminder that the monarchy, despite its ancient traditions and ceremonial grandeur, was still vulnerable to human weakness and ambition. It also demonstrated that sometimes it takes just one person with integrity and courage to protect an entire institution from those who would exploit it for their own purposes. The Royal Guard had done more than stop an unauthorized substitution. He had preserved the very principles that make the monarchy worthy of respect and admiration. In doing so, he had shown that true loyalty to the crown sometimes means saying no to those who wear it.